Shalom and welcome to today's Middle East Report. In this program today I have a remarkable interview with a reserve captain in the IDF who encountered God in the most amazing way in Israel's war against Hezbollah in Lebanon back in 2006. Warm welcome to the programme, and my special guest today, all the way from Israel, is Stefan Silver. Stefan, welcome to the Middle East Report.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And many of our viewers will know your father very well, David Silver, so it's great that you're on the programme today. Can you share with us something about your remarkable story and testimony? You're born in New Zealand, and then from the age of 8, you and your family moved to Israel. Can you share what life was like growing up as a believer in New Zealand?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was born into a family that when I was very young, my parents basically weren't believers, but ever since I can remember myself, about the age of 3, they both came to faith, and that's kind of their own story. But since I can remember myself, I grew up in a believing family. We came to Israel twice on tour in 1990 and 1991 when I was a kid, and so I had quite a good experience about Israel in Israel during those years. But I grew up, I would say, in a very protected environment. All my family were believers. I went to a believing school, a Christian school, private one in New Zealand. And I guess just grew up in a very protected environment in that sense. And then after 1991, when we toured here as a family, we were back in New Zealand, and basically God spoke to my parents and said to them, it's time to leave New Zealand, sell everything, sever all ties, and move back to the land of your forefathers, back to the land of Israel. And so they were obedient to that call, and in that I obviously didn't have any say in it whatsoever, but was part of that move, and we were basically uprooted. We uprooted ourselves entirely from New Zealand and replanted back in Israel. And the move was certainly not easy. That's probably an understatement. Going from New Zealand, where it's the climate is one way, and the people and the politeness and the food and just everything, the language, it's just one world, and Israel is a completely different world. For those who have visited Israel would know. And so I moved there basically not knowing any Hebrew whatsoever. I was just off the age of 8. We went from a beautiful home that my parents had just built a couple of years beforehand. Me and my brother had our own rooms, 2 stories, double garage, big garden in the back, like big backyard. Good school that we went to, family all around us, cousins, aunties, uncles, grandparents, everything that is typical for a family. And landed in Israel in the middle of summer, 1992, went to an absorption center, which is where most people that were immigrating back to Israel at that time, kind of the middle of the major immigration from the former Soviet Union back to Israel. So there were a lot of immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and probably one Kiwi family amongst all of them. And so we found ourselves in an immigration, an absorption center, which is probably your prisons here in the UK are nicer than the absorption center that we were in back then. Very, very small apartment, just kind of one small bedroom where my parents were. My brother and I slept in the living room on the sofas. I wouldn't call it a sofa, it was more of just a piece of wood with 4 legs and a very thin mattress on it. At nighttime it was our bedroom, in the daytime it was our living room. Small kitchen, and that was basically it. Very, very simple, very, very basic. And we were there for the first 8 or 9 months of living in Israel. We arrived, I think it was the 28th, the 29th of July, 1992, and school begins in Israel on September 1st, I think, like here in the UK as well. And so I didn't know any Hebrew whatsoever. The absorption center was in an immigrant area in a place called Kiryat Yam, which is a suburb just beneath Haifa, a little bit north of Haifa. And I was sent to this school, just a regular public Israeli school in one of the worst socioeconomic areas in the greater Haifa area. Not knowing a word of Hebrew, not having any friends, not having any family besides my parents and my younger brother, who was about 4 at the time, knew no one whatsoever. And so that's the environment that I was thrusted into at this age. And so it was definitely not an easy experience. The kids at school were not very sympathetic. There was a lot of picking on me and just kind of mocking and laughing and things like that. I didn't even know what these guys were talking about because I didn't speak any Hebrew. The teachers weren't very sympathetic either. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and would yell and get angry all the time. And I just didn't know what was going on. And it wasn't until about 8 months later or 9 months later that we moved out of the absorption center into our own apartment up on Mount Carmel in the city of Haifa, where I still live today, and moved to a different school in a slightly better area with kids that knew a little bit of English and whose parents knew English. Just a different environment altogether, that I really started picking up on the Hebrew and was able to make some good friends, and was able to kind of begin to integrate into the society. But those first months were certainly very, very difficult. I think that they certainly shaped me and helped mold a lot of my personality and just the person that I am today. But still, an experience that is not an easy experience to go through, and anybody that's moved when they were kids would know about that. But it's one thing to move from a city, let's say in the nation that you were born in, to another city and another school, but going from one nation or one country like New Zealand, which is so peaceful and so beautiful and everybody knows what it's like, to Israel, the middle of the Middle East, where the mentality and the language, everything is just completely different. English, the alphabet, and Hebrew, completely different, left to right, right to left. It's all opposite in all ways. And so it really was a complete turnaround in that sense. And so that's really how I grew up in those years. But afterwards, as time went on, I made some good friends and basically went through my primary school and then moved into junior high and high school after that, along with some of those friends that I made in those initial months after we moved up onto the mountain, up onto Mount Carmel.
Did you have any difficulties knowing that your father was a Messianic believer in Israel? And did that ever cause you any problems?
I don't know if I would say that it caused me any problems, but it certainly, I always knew that I was very different in that sense. And I think from a young age, I knew who we were as believers, Yeshua, Jesus. In Israel, he's not known as Yeshua, which is his Hebrew name. Those were the words, that was the sound that would have come out of the mouth of the angel when he came and spoke to Joseph and said, "You will call your son Yeshua, because he will save his people from their sins." Name Yeshua means salvation. So sometimes in the English we miss those things. In the Hebrew it makes perfect sense. You will call his name salvation because he will save his people from their sins. And so I knew that we were different in that sense. And growing up, I was hearing this name Yeshu, which is how they call Jesus in Israel, because he's not viewed to be an Israeli Jew. He's viewed to be a Christian from somewhere else, but not one of our own people. And the name Yeshu, how he's known in Israel, stands for Imach Shmo v'zichro, may his name and memory be blotted out, be erased. And that's something that has been kind of inserted in through the Jewish writings over time. And unfortunately, that's how he is known. And so when, anything like about my faith or anything, then it comes up in that context. And so it certainly makes you feel that you're an outsider, that you're not, you're not of the Jewish people, even though I am Jewish. But in Israel, people who believe in Jesus and Yeshua as the Messiah are not viewed to be Jewish anymore. They're viewed to be Christians, that they basically converted to another faith or another religion, and therefore are no longer part of the Jewish religion, and therefore are no longer Jewish either. And so growing up, in that context and in that environment, then sure, those were difficulties and things I think that I dealt with, and to be perfectly honest, some times that I was ashamed of that, I was embarrassed of that. I don't think any young person or teenager wants to feel left out in any way. And in any case, those years are years that people are, young people are trying to find themselves and fit in, and the last thing that you want is to stand out. And so it was definitely another factor that made it, more difficult, and just feeling that there was something different between me and the rest of my friends, my secular friends, in that sense, yeah.
So tell us about your life in the military. Every Israeli has to, at the age of 17, drafted into military service for 3 years. I think it's for females, it's 1.5 years to 2 years. Can you share what it was like when you knew that you were going to be drafted for your service in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force?
Yeah, it was something that I was looking forward to. I think every young person in Israel who is growing up knows that that's something that they're going to have to do at some point. And whether they like it or not, they're going to have to deal with it at some stage. I was looking forward to it. I was planning, and my desire was to be an Air Force pilot. I went through a number of the testing stages in order to enter flight school. Unfortunately, I reached the final stages, but I wasn't accepted in the end. I think I was, wanting just to excel basically in anything that I could do within the military. Eventually, when I was drafted, I found myself in the Combat Engineering Corps, which is the unit that deals with explosives, demolitions, infantry work as well, and it was definitely an interesting unit to be in. I think a lot of kids, when they're young, especially boys, are always playing with firecrackers and wanting to blow things up and play around with guns and things like that. So this was kind of those dreams, so to speak, becoming a reality in a way. And I think even before I went into the military, I knew that I wanted to be an officer. I wanted to be a commander. I wanted to be able to lead. I wanted to be able to influence situations and also, command and just, excel the best I could. And so I was drafted when in November 2002. I was just over the age of 18 in a couple of months, and began my service. I did basic training, I did advanced training, I did some initial combat, got some initial combat experience. Then I went for a non-commissioned officers course, an NCO course, and then after that went directly into an officers course. And then after 2 years, I became a second lieutenant and received command of a platoon in a combat unit in the combat engineering, one of the combat engineering regiments. To begin with, our outpost was actually inside Ramallah, and so there was a lot of action there, a lot of dealing with the terrorists, arrests, things that were going on in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank area during that time. And it was an interesting time, yeah.
I can imagine. Also, that was the height of the Second Intifada, wasn't it? Back in 2002, when Israel, under the leadership of Ariel Sharon, launched a military offensive against the Palestinian Authority and the terrorist elements within the Palestinian Authority, such as, I think, the Tanzim and Palestinian Islamic Jihad as well, in Judea and Samaria. Did you experience any of that firsthand?
Yeah, when I went into the military in 2002, my commanders had just experienced that themselves. And but that we came when I entered the military, and by the time I got into combat, it was kind of the back end of that. So it was definitely still going on, but it wasn't as intense as it was during those years of 2002 with the operations that took place then and the Second Intifada that had happened during that time. But there was definitely a lot of continuation of that, though maybe lower intensity. But that was certainly some of the things that we were dealing with in my first months in the unit that I was in.
Yeah, and being a commander, certainly an officer in the Israeli army, you have so many men under you. How do you keep the morale up, and how do you inspire them?
Yeah, it's not easy, to be honest. Israel's military, the IDF, is a people's military. You can't. It's not a professional military. You don't choose if you want to go in. You're drafted. And all of us guys and girls that get drafted into the military are basically 18, 19-year-olds who, while we do have a lot of responsibility in the military and the various positions that we're in, but really, you know, we're just kids, or they're just kids, and they're interested in having a fun time and enjoying life, and not necessarily being stuck in the military and in some unit and not being able to go home and not be able to do the things that they would rather prefer to do in their lives. And so it's certainly a challenge to keep morale high. I think mainly in the military or in the combat units, a lot of soldiers come in with high morale anyway. So it's a matter of maintaining that. I think a lot of the soldiers in the combat units pride themselves on the operations that they take part in, the achievements that they have been able to reach, you know, whether it be the seizure of a terrorist or prevention of a terror attack.
Stefan, also, can you share with us what it's like being in command of so many soldiers, but also knowing that you are a believer in Yeshua HaMashiach? How much impact did that have on you, being a believer and a soldier?
Yeah, to be honest, during those years in the military, once I already became an officer, that was after 2 years. I ended up doing 4 years of service, 1 extra year as an officer. And by that time, even though I'd grown up as a believer, my walk with the Lord, you know, my faith was not as strong as what it used to be, which is something that I believe most of the young Messianic believers experience in the military. Just being in that environment 24/7, sometimes for weeks on end without going home, makes it, or has an influence and takes a toll on the faith, and it did with me. And so at that time, to be honest, I wasn't, my walk with the Lord wasn't very strong. Being in command of soldiers, you do have a lot of opportunity to influence them. You are their commanding officer, and you can, you know, you speak with them all the time, you're seeing them all the time, you're taking care of their lives, you're basically in charge of them, everything that's going on with them while they're in the military and also while they're at home as well. So any domestic issues that they're having, any problems that they're having at home, then you as the commanding officer are required to take care of them and look out for them in that regard. So I believe that a number of soldiers did know that I was a Messianic Jew. A number of my soldiers did know that, but it wasn't something that I spoke about very often. That being said, I do think that the things I had grown up on, the morals and my knowledge of, you know, what Yeshua speaks about in the scriptures about loving your enemies and about, you know, caring for people, even though they may not like you, even though they may be using you, in that environment of being involved with the populations that we were involved with, you know, in Judea and Samaria, in the West Bank area, not simple situations to deal with. Those were certainly things I think that still helped me navigate through a lot of, you know, complex situations, and eventually also be able to convey those to my soldiers as well, certain things that I just wouldn't tolerate, where in maybe other places in the military or other commanders would go and do things that weren't maybe as moral as they should be. So I think it definitely, I was able to have a higher moral standard in just dealing with people and seeing people for who they are, and I guess looking at them not with eyes of hate or anything like that, but just trying to see them also, even though perhaps enemies, so to speak, but understanding that they are people in need of a savior, just like me and just like everybody else in this world.
Absolutely. And Stefan, share with us how your life changed on the 12th of July 2006 when the Islamist terrorist organization, Hezbollah, sponsored by the Iranian regime, infiltrated Israeli territory, murdered 8 Israeli soldiers and captured 2 soldiers that triggered what's known as the Second Lebanon War. How did that change your life?
Yeah, well, actually, I think it happened a few weeks beforehand when Gilad Shalit was abducted down in the Gaza Strip. And so my unit was actually, we were down in Gaza, we were actually preparing to go down there and be part of what was going on down in that area, because it seemed that area in the south was beginning to flare up. So we were in a training period up in the Golan Heights, and then everything happened that you just described on July 12th, 2006. And so my unit was basically, we had a change of plan. Instead of going down to Gaza, we were sent directly over to the northern border, which was just not very far away. And we were on the front lines of the war from the first few days of the conflict, or of the war. I believe from the second or third day, we were right there with the initial forces that were beginning to go into southern Lebanon, something that the military didn't want to do back then, because they knew how many explosives and IEDs and how prepared, so to speak, the area was and had been prepared by Hezbollah, knowing that at some point the IDF was going to re-enter southern Lebanon, and basically the place was just riddled with explosives and traps and all kinds of things like that. And so we were going in with the first units that were infiltrating southern Lebanon, participated in some of the fiercest battles that were going on in places like Ait Shab and Maun Aras and Binchbil, where a lot of soldiers were killed. You know, I had 3.5 years of military experience up until that point, 1.5 years as an officer already, but had never really been in any life-threatening situations. I'd never seen anybody die beforehand, never been exposed to any real danger up until that point. And then all of a sudden, it was like everything just broke loose. And up until then, there were always very, very strict rules of engagement. You know, you're not allowed to fire your weapon. It has to be done in a certain procedure. And that we never got to that stage. I had never gotten to that stage. I'd never fired my weapon outside of a firing range before. And here now, during this time of war, basically everything just broke open. And we were using munitions that we had never used before out in the open. We were firing our weapons like it was pretty much like not the Wild West, but just without any limitations almost whatsoever, because it was a war situation. And the amount of ammunition and explosives and things that we were taking with us each time, I'd never seen anything like that up until that point in my military service. And so obviously being exposed to people dying and the way that people were dying, it wasn't just somebody that passed away of old age, but soldiers that had been killed in not very pleasant ways. Being exposed to that, my unit also was involved with a number of rescue attempts and extraction attempts that were successful of soldiers that had been killed. You know, we had one time I was in one of our armored personnel carriers. Right next to us there was a tank, military IDF tank, the Mark IV, which is Israel's most advanced tank, and the Second Lebanon War was its first baptism of fire, you could say. And that tank was right next to us, and we had basically been moving all night, and the morning had come, and in the daytime we were staying put because we were exposed then. And so it was about 11 in the morning. I think we had stopped moving at about 5 or 6 a.m. as the sun was coming up. And this tank started its engine, and that woke me up. And it drove forward up onto this embankment that one of the big D9 bulldozers had created for us to sit inside or hide behind. So in the Second Lebanon War, one of the main threats were anti-tank missiles that were being fired against both armored personnel vehicles and tanks and infantry soldiers inside buildings and behind concrete and brick walls. And these missiles were very, very messy, and when they made contact with soldiers that were either inside the vehicles or behind the walls or inside these buildings, made a very, very big mess. And so we were driving around in our APCs, our armored personnel carriers, as combat engineering soldiers. We have a lot of equipment with us. And so we were driving around in these vehicles, and they're basically tanks that have been converted. They took the turret out, they take them out, and they modify it to fit more soldiers and more equipment inside. But these vehicles have very large 12-cylinder turbo diesel engines. They have big metal tracks, just like any tank would have. They make a lot of noise, they kick up a lot of dust and blow out a lot of smoke. They're not very fast or agile, and they're easy to hit. And so during that time, even though my walk with the Lord was not very strong, I did know that He was indeed God. And I did believe that he could hear prayer. And so I made a deal with him, so to speak, and I was basically praying and asking him, please make me and my soldiers invisible. Literally like that. Make us invisible from these Hezbollah terrorists so that they cannot hit me or my soldiers with these anti-tank missiles. At that point, I had about 90 to 100 soldiers under my command. I was a deputy company commander. And I was, that's my prayer exactly. And my deal with God was, please watch over me, protect me and my soldiers, make us invisible, bring me through this war. I was supposed to be discharged a few months later in November of that year. So yeah, at that time in my military service, I wasn't really walking with the Lord anymore, and I was really looking at finishing my time in the military. A few months later, I was supposed to be discharged in November of that year, 2006, and I was thinking about going and traveling with my friends to South America, having a good time. Wasn't at all expecting this war to happen, and wasn't really at all thinking about anything spiritual at that point either. And I still knew that God was indeed real. I knew that he could hear my prayers. I was just choosing out of my own free will that I did not want to follow him, and I did not want to make him number one in my life, and I did not want to base my life or live my life according to his will for me, but according to my will for myself. And so I was praying, and I was asking God to watch over and protect me and my soldiers, specifically to make us invisible because of the vehicles that we were traveling around in, which were very large 12-cylinder turbo diesel APCs, armored personnel carriers, basically modified tanks that the turrets had been removed and had been modified to fit more men and be able to take all of our equipment with them. And these vehicles made a lot of noise, made a lot of smoke, were not very agile or fast, and were just easy targets for the anti-tank missiles. And so about halfway through the war, my regiment commander had fallen over and he had hurt his back. He needed to be replaced, and so there was a ceremony, a replacement ceremony. And during that ceremony, one of the we were standing, a few of the officers in the regiment, and we were talking, and another officer, same rank as me, same position as me, from a different company, he said, you know what, Stefan, it's really amazing that neither you or any of your soldiers have been hit yet by any of these anti-tank missiles or any of these explosives that have been, IEDs in the ground. He said, it's like you guys are absolutely invisible.
Wow.
And yeah, when he said that, it was just, I knew that God was speaking to me through that officer, who wasn't even a believer, saying to me, Stefan, I am hearing your prayers. I am watching over you. I am protecting you, and I'm protecting your soldiers as well. I am being faithful to what you have asked of me. And that really cut to my heart, obviously. And I think that was the defining point where I decided, if this is what God is doing for me, then I should be living my life also fully for him. And so that's when I guess decided as a grown adult, of my own free will, that yes, it's not something that I have grown up with, being a Messianic Jew, but it's something that I really believe in for myself. And I have seen God watch over and protect me and my soldiers. And the result of that time in Lebanon, anywhere between, I think it was almost 8 weeks inside Lebanon in the fiercest battles that took place during the Second Lebanon War. I do not know of another unit that was in Lebanon for as long as we were in Lebanon that took place in the battles that we took part in, that did not sustain any soldiers that were killed or wounded. And I did not have any such soldiers that were wounded or killed whatsoever under my command. I had one soldier that broke his arm because he fell off the top of one of these armored personnel carriers, but that was inside Israel, and he was kind of goofing around as well, so he somewhat deserved it in a way, but he was not wounded in battle in any way whatsoever. And that's the testimony that God watched over and protected me and my soldiers during that time supernaturally. And the verses that I was reading to my soldiers every time that we would go on an assignment was Psalm 91, which is really about supernatural protection, and it's about he who abides in the shadow of the Almighty. And for me, it's that, as I understood it, that person who is in relationship with God, who knows God, he will protect them, he will watch over them. and I could really go over that psalm verse by verse and show you how literal it was for me during those weeks and months inside Lebanon in those combat situations that I was involved with.
Let's have a look now at the threat that Hezbollah posed to Israel and the enemy that Israel faced back in 2006.
Hezbollah is a terrorist organization that was founded in 1982. Since then, its militants have committed attacks worldwide. In fact, up until 9/11, Hezbollah had killed more Americans than any other terror group. In 1983 and 1984, Hezbollah carried out 2 attacks on the American embassy in Lebanon, killing 86 people.
The explosion devastated the embassy.
A Hezbollah suicide bomber took down a plane in Panama in 1994, killing 21 people. In the same year, Hezbollah bombed the AMIA in Buenos Aires, killing 85 people. More recently, in 2012, a Hezbollah suicide bomber killed 6 people in an attack in the Burgas airport. And they're not showing any signs of stopping. Hezbollah has collected more than 120,000 rockets and has trained 45,000 fighters, making them one of the largest and well-armed terror organizations. Israel feels this threat more than anyone else. Hezbollah is just across our border, and since its establishment, this terror organization has carried out thousands of attacks against Israeli civilians, including launching hundreds of rockets at Israeli cities.
Hezbollah is a terrorist group with a mission to destroy Israel, and frankly, if given the chance, us too.
Again and again, Hezbollah proves that their goal isn't peace. It's terror, and it needs to stop.
Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed terrorist organization in de facto control of southern Lebanon, justifies its ongoing war against Israel as a territorial dispute. Is that really the case? In the year 2000, Israel withdrew from every inch of Lebanese territory across the internationally recognized Blue Line. Since then, Israel's territory has been under constant attack. Cities and towns were bombed with projectiles, and several IDF soldiers were abducted and held as hostages. Tensions peaked in July 2006, the Second Lebanon War. Hezbollah fired around 4,000 rockets into Israel during the 34-day conflict and killed 44 Israeli civilians. UN Security Council Resolution 1701 ended the war, determining that the only armed forces south of the Litani River will be the UN and the Lebanese army. But since then, Hezbollah, which resides in southern Lebanon, has dramatically increased the size of its rocket arsenal.
We are deeply concerned about the military capacity of Hezbollah.
Hezbollah has over 60,000 rockets and missiles.
Hezbollah has far more rockets and missiles than most governments in the world.
Some of Hezbollah's rockets can reach up to 600 kilometers. They can strike anywhere in Israel, as well as parts of neighboring countries. Hezbollah has built a vast underground tunnel network in southern Lebanon, which it uses to hide weapon stocks and fighters during military operations. In March 2011, Israel published an intelligence report revealing over 1,000 military sites across Lebanon, including more than 500 interconnected bunkers and 300 listening posts. One example is the village of El Khiyam, which hides dozens of Hezbollah bunkers and weapons depots in the middle of a densely populated area, including near UN buildings. This is an intentional strategy. By flooding populated areas with illegal arms, Hezbollah intends to use the population as a human shield. How does Hezbollah continue these terrorist activities? The money trail leads to Iran. The organization receives over $100 million of Iranian funding a year, along with vast amounts of arms and ammunition.
By far the most significant donor to Hezbollah is Iran.
Iranian-made Grad rockets were fired at Israel in the 2006 war, so Israel has good reason to remain vigilant. Hezbollah's ideology is Iran's ideology. It is a proxy of Iran in Lebanon with one goal, a war of jihad in order to eradicate Israel.
Can you describe for us what kind of enemy Hezbollah is and what you and your forces were up against in southern Lebanon during that war in 2006?
Yeah, sure. Well, up until that point, really, most of my military service was either on Israel's northern borders, but there was no real military activity going on per se, or in Judea and Samaria, where the enemy that we were encountering there was not nearly at the same level as what we encountered in Lebanon during the Second Lebanon War. And really what we saw with the Hezbollah soldiers, or fighters should I say, was a much better trained fighting force with munitions that were much higher quality and much more professional than what we were seeing and what we had seen beforehand. In Judea and Samaria, many of the weapons that we found were even handmade weapons that were just, altered and put together in some metal factory. And then here in southern Lebanon, we were encountering these Russian, Soviet-made anti-tank missiles, AK-47s, submachine guns, much different munitions than what we had encountered beforehand. And not only were the munitions different, but obviously the training was different. And I think the psychology and the psychological readiness that the Hezbollah fighters had was a lot different than what we were encountering in Judea and Samaria, and also what we had seen in Gaza beforehand, even with Hamas, which at that point weren't nearly as trained and as prepared as what they are today. And we saw with these Hezbollah fighters that they were very ready to engage us and were actively doing so, all the time. One of the stories I can tell you is there was a tank that had been hit during a night operation, and we needed to go in and remove some of the internal systems that were left inside the turret of the tank and basically pull it back out. And as we were doing that with bulldozers and doing a whole night operation around it, we came under attack. And the analysis was that the Hezbollah fighters thought that they had hit us and that there were soldiers wounded, and they actually sent 3 vehicles with their own fighters in them in these Land Rover Jeeps in a very quick convoy up the hill towards us in order to try and abduct either soldiers that were alive and wounded, or to try and take bodies of soldiers that they thought that maybe they had killed. No such thing had happened, and we were able to destroy them before they reached us. But it just shows the audacity that they had, and the lack of fear and the willingness and the ability to come and engage the IDF soldiers right there and then. Something that we hadn't seen up until that point.
Also during that deadly battle that you fought in southern Lebanon in 2006, it was also widely reported that the Iranians had placed also the Iranian Revolutionary Guards in supporting Hezbollah and also engaging in that warfare. And that really showed the world that this wasn't really a war between Israel and Hezbollah, but this was a war between Israel and their sponsors of Hezbollah, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Did you encounter any of that?
I personally didn't, no. Perhaps other units did. We personally did not, but that is something that I think we have seen grow, and especially recently with recent events that have taken place in Israel, have seen that strengthening even more so. And I think that while that may not have been the case entirely in the Second Lebanon War, the next time that there is a conflict in the north, I think it's something that we'll probably see a lot more of.
When it comes to Hezbollah, now they are sponsored by the Islamic Republic of Iran, very much an agent of the Iranian regime. Not only that, but they do not abide by the Geneva Convention, use asymmetrical warfare, and use women and children as human shields. How difficult was it to actually engage in against an enemy that does not abide by the conduct of modern warfare?
It's very difficult. I think the area that we were operating in southern Lebanon, and also the recent conflicts that have taken place in Gaza, the IDF goes to great extents to remove all civilians from those areas that they know they're going to be operating in, even to the point that the enemy knows exactly where the IDF is going to be entering from, because the IDF in Israel does not want to see civilian casualties and wants to minimize that to the smallest amount as possible. And so the entire area was leafleted leaflets were dropped from planes warning the civilians that the IDF is about to enter into southern Lebanon, leave now, so that you don't get harmed. And so our assumption was that anybody that was in that area who was not an IDF soldier was a terrorist, and that was in fact the case. I think the Air Force encountered that more when they were needing to take out rocket launches that were found inside schools, inside buildings where people were living, and they needed to figure out, how do we take out these rocket launches that are being fired into Israel to hit civilian population without harming the civilian population that was being used to try and hide those rocket launches.
And Stephen, can you describe the situation for the likes of your parents living in Haifa during that conflict, primarily because it was almost as if the entire northern population of Israel had to move south to be out of the range of these rockets and missiles?
Yeah, it wasn't an easy time for anybody, I don't think. And I actually remember the first time that I got some leave from the war, which is after 40 days of being up on the northern border inside Lebanon. My brother had just gone into the military in August of 2006, or July, I think it was, and he was doing his basic training down south near Beersheba. And I was home, I had a military vehicle with me, and he was coming up on the train to the Haifa train station down by the beach, Hofa Carmel, the Haifa beach, if you're familiar with it.
Yeah, very familiar.
And as I'm driving down the mountain to pick him up, all of a sudden the sirens go off. Now, I'm not used to the sirens going off because I'm inside Lebanon most of this time. So I hadn't experienced rockets coming in being at home. And so the siren went off, most people just kept on driving, and so did I. And as I'm driving down the mountain, I heard one explosion and saw it, and then saw another one out at inside the ocean. And as I'm driving, right underneath there's an underpass where the highway goes, and right next to it is the train tracks, and there's some very large high-tech buildings, lots of glass, lots of vehicles parked outside. One of the rockets had hit right on the overpass on the highway. Fortunately, there was nobody driving there at that time, so no vehicles were hit, but all of the glass on the entire side of the building was completely shattered. All the alarms in the vehicles that were parked in the parking lot were all going off. Many of their windows had been shattered as well, and the train got delayed because they needed to make sure that there was no debris or no explosive parts that were lying around the area that could harm the train. And eventually they let the train come in. I picked my brother up, but kind of in a funny way, I said, I want to go back up to inside Lebanon to the border area, because at least the rockets aren't falling there. They're only falling further down. So I think for all of the population, it was very difficult to learn to deal with that situation, and that was the first time, especially in Haifa, that they had to deal with that. That's just the reality of that war, and I think that's going to be the reality of the next wars as well.
Sadly, this was a war that Israel couldn't win in terms of, this asymmetrical warfare, dealing with Islamic terrorist organizations who, like I said before, do not abide by the Geneva Convention on Warfare. And there's always that fear that if you actually defeat them, then something worse could take its place. But I can't imagine a worse terrorist organization than Hezbollah, maybe ISIS. But no, they're very much equal in terms of their hatred and the sheer evilness of these organizations. But in terms of having a military victory, the media and the international community and saw this as a Hezbollah victory. But we know that this is not true, because of the damage done to Hezbollah and Hezbollah's fighting capabilities, that we haven't really seen a mass escalation conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. A few skirmishes, but nothing at the scale that equals 2006. What damage did you and your fellow soldiers do to Hezbollah in that war?
I think, and this was talked about a lot inside Israel as well, and has been since the war, that by all means, up on the tactical level, which is probably up to the level of a brigade, the IDF was triumphant in every engagement with the enemy. You know, that when you look at the ratio of Hezbollah fighters killed versus Israeli soldiers killed, I mean, those numbers tell the story. The IDF certainly was victorious in that engagement. On a strategic level, which is, you know, the higher echelons and higher commands of the military, and especially the government, which was, I think, somewhat hesitant and caused a lot of confusion because of the decisions that were or were not being made, it caused difficulties in the military level. And so I can give you some examples of you know, units that were sent to one location and then withdrawn and sent to another location, and there was no, at many times there wasn't a clear agenda of what it is that we're trying to achieve. And so with a lack of that, which needs to come from the levels of government, it creates problems on the lower levels as well. But certainly on the tactical level, like I said, every engagement with Hezbollah was victorious. You know, the IDF sustained casualties as well. Every war, every army does. But I think that had the government been more in charge and defined clearer what are the goals, what were the goals of that war, like they did in the final couple of days, which was very clear. They sent troops far into Lebanon, dropped them through helicopter, cut off enemy supplies, and then the plan was to move south and to clear out that entire area, taking our time. But then the ceasefire kicked in, and basically that plan was only beginning to be utilized. So I think had that been done to begin with, the story on the strategic level, or the outcome on the strategic level, would have been completely different. And I think that Israel learned its lesson from that, and probably the next time we'll see something different altogether.
Yeah, let's have a look now at this I-24 news report, which is video footage that has emerged about how Hezbollah started the Second Lebanon War back in July of 2006.
10 years ago, and after 2 Israeli soldiers were kidnapped, sparking the Second Lebanon War between Israel and Hezbollah. Hezbollah released new footage of preparations made by its militants for the operation that sparked the war. Shai Ben Ali with more on this never-before-seen footage.
The 10-year anniversary of the conflict known as the Second Lebanon War is being marked on both sides of Israel's border with Lebanon. The Lebanese channel Al Mayadeen, which is seen as a close ally of the Hezbollah militant group, has broadcast previously unseen footage of the organization's preparations for the incident which triggered the war. A cross-border ambush of an IDF force on July 12, 2006, and the abduction of the bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers quickly led to a full-on conflict, which lasted 34 days. These are the 2 Israeli Hummers shortly before they were attacked. Good morning, everyone, one of the IDF soldiers says to his friends over a radio transmission. And these are rare images of Imad Murnia, the iconic former Hezbollah commander who is seen personally instructing Hezbollah militants as they drill an attack on IDF vehicles.
Have someone shoot at the vehicle. Better to have 2 shooting from the same direction, and keep shooting as it advances.
Imad Murnia was killed in a mysterious explosion in Damascus about 2 years after this footage was shot, a strike often attributed to Israel. Haj Qasim was another Hezbollah commander who would later be killed in the war itself. He is also seen briefing the members of the attack cell.
Open your eyes. You must aim carefully and fire at the vehicle once it reaches the agreed upon location.
In a different segment, Qasim crouches right next to the border fence in broad daylight, wearing his uniform as he takes measurements. The presence of Hezbollah along the same border today is much more discreet.
And we also have footage now of Stefan's tank unit coming back from Southern Lebanon when the war's finished.
always returning from Southern Lebanon with you know, the constant feeling of being on the defensive while in there was always a very exhilarating feeling, and I think you can see here in the clip these soldiers of mine who are very, very glad to be back in after a few days of being in Lebanon. And I remember the last time that we left Lebanon coming back to Israel, my CO called me on the encrypted phone, and he said to me, "Stefan, you need to really be careful because we've intercepted this communication message between a high-ranking Hezbollah official saying that they're asking the head of their demolitions unit to come down to the south and deal with a unit of armored personnel carriers that are in the western sector." And I thought to myself, wow, there must be a few various units in the area. And then he said to me, "And you guys are the only unit there in the area." And so
okay, we got some photos on the screen, Stefan. Can you describe who these people are, because they served in your unit under your leadership?
Yeah, sure. So this is the company commander who I commanded the company with. His name is Adi. That's a picture of him inside the armored personnel carrier on that same day as we came back. That's a picture of the armored personnel carrier that we would travel around. It's called a Puma in Hebrew. One of my soldiers found that Hezbollah flag during our incursion there. It was riddled with bullet holes, and he lifted it up as we were coming back over the border, and the press was liking it quite a bit. And again, here you can see some of the guys joking around afterwards, feeling very happy to be back in Israel.
And that must be you.
It looks a little bit like me, yeah. Skinnier version, maybe. Yeah.
Excellent. And Stefan, we only got a few minutes left of the programme. So sadly, the threat from Hezbollah has not gone away. It's believed now that Hezbollah has something in the region of 160,000 rockets aimed at Israel. And we know that Hezbollah has been involved in propping up Assad's regime and has opened up a new front, and that's a front in Syria. What is the prospect of another war with Hezbollah in the near future, considering the changing strategic situation on the ground in Syria? We've got 2 minutes before the end of the programme.
Yeah, you know, I think even at the end of the Second Lebanon War back in 2006, it was never a question of if there's going to be another conflict with Hezbollah. It was only a question of when there's going to be another conflict with Hezbollah. And like you said, Hezbollah have gained a lot more experience with their involvement in everything that's going on in Syria. They have rearmed to a level which is much higher than what they were armed or how they were armed prior to the war of 2006. And so, like I said, it's only a matter of when. And it seems like that when is going to be happening sooner rather than later. Nobody knows when. You know, the Middle East is a very, very flammable environment, and really anything can set a conflict off. Just like with the Second Lebanon War, nobody expected a war, but then Hezbollah came. They had abducted 2 Israeli soldiers, killed a number of soldiers, and it just developed into a fully fledged war. And the same thing could happen really any day. And you know, as we're recording this, just a couple of days ago with the events with the F-16 that was shot down over Israel, again, that could easily spiral into a war with Hezbollah, with Syria, and with Iran in the same way. And so, like I said, it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when.
Stefan, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report, and thank you for sharing your incredible story of how God protected you and your unit in that war in Lebanon in 2006.
My pleasure. Thank you, Simon.
Pleasure. And I just want to thank you for watching today's programme. What we learn is that the God of Israel is our protector, and that's why it's so important that we lift up the IDF in prayer for their bravery, for their courage, but also for their protection. And we leave you with this song, which is in tribute to those brave men and women serving in the IDF today.